we'll get going here. And to advance it, Mung, to advance the slides, just click them. Good enough. All right. This is going to be a somewhat abbreviated version of what I normally talk about regarding weed control. As Mung said, we discussed the weed identification a few weeks back, and so now I'm going to get into some strategies for weed management, particularly as they relate to turfgrass. One thing I should mention is that many of the strategies and many of the products that I'll talk about can also be used in landscape beds and even gardens in some cases. So if you have any questions specific to landscape beds or gardens, please enter those in here, and I'll try to cover those at the end. Obviously, the first thing that we need to do if we're talking about weed management, it's like any other pest. We have to know what we're going after. And in the case of weed identification, I don't get real hung up on getting the weed down to the genus and the species. But we do have to make a couple fundamental decisions right off the bat so that we can select a proper control measure. And the first one is, of course, decide whether we've got a broadleaf versus a grass weed or a sedge. Okay, and it probably doesn't take a PhD from Texas Tech to figure out whether you've got a broadleaf or a grass in most cases. Most of the time, and most of the confusion results when our homeowners want to identify a sedge as a grass and think that they can control sedges with the same products or methods that they'll use on grasses, and that is just plain not the case. We have to understand that sedges are as different from grasses as they are from broadleaf weeds. So again, with that in mind, we can move forward from that standpoint and then decide whether we've got an annual weed or a perennial. And since most of you are in the horticultural business, you understand the difference relative to horticultural plants, whether they're annuals or perennials. And I've got something popping up here. I'm not sure where that's. Sorry. Anyway, so let's just go ahead and move forward from there and talk a little bit about our logical sequence here. And again, try to figure out whether you've got a broadleaf versus a grass versus sedge. And if you look at a stem cross-cut section here, in the case of broadleaf, normally that will be solid. Sometimes it's pithy. You may have either a round or a square stem. If it's in the mint family, it's going to have a square stem in there, like henbit, for example, which is a weed that we have a lot of during the winter months. In the case of the grass, you'll normally, again, this will either be hollow or rolled leaf appearance. In the case of sedges are always going to have a triangular crosscut look to them. So if you cut the base of the plant, you'll see the leaves either rolled or the stem, this triangular shape may be pithy inside or solid, but it's going to have a triangular shape. So therefore you can decide right off the bat whether you've got a sedge or a grass, and of course whether or not you've got a broadleaf weed as well. So again, it's not a big stretch to figure out whether you've got a broadleaf or a grass versus a sedge. It's just real important to know that. The next thing, excuse me, let me back up. The next thing we have to decide, of course, is whether we've got an annual or a perennial. In the case of the sedges, most of the sedges that we're going to have major issues with, they're going to be perennials for the most part, whether we're talking about green kalinga or yellow or purple nutsedge, and I'll go through some descriptions of those here in a little bit. Our grasses, of course, are most of what we have trouble with, generally going to be annual grasses like crabgrass or goosegrass or something like that. We do have, of course, KR blue stem, which is a perennial. And again, I'll show you some pictures of those here in just a little bit. And then in the case of broadleafs, the easiest way to determine whether or not you have an annual or a perennial is if you extract the plant from the soil or pull the plant up. If it has, especially if it's young, if it either has a very simple or very simple fibrous root system or a simple taproot system, and it doesn't look like it's broke off of something fleshy underneath, then you've likely got an annual plant. In the case of a perennial will have a much more robust root system and usually have some main rhizomes that break off from plant parts that are underneath the surface of the soil. Another thing that's really important to understand, especially if we're using prophylactic treatments like pre-emergent herbicides and things like that, we have to get an impression as to whether or not our weed is a summer annual, a winter annual, a biennial, or a perennial. And again, you're probably familiar with these terms, a summer annual being one weed that comes up in the springtime, undergoes most of its vegetative growth during the summer, then sets seed and dies off in the fall. A winter annual is just the flip side of that, essentially where the weed comes up after the winter heat dies down a little bit in September, October, goes through most of its vegetative growth through the winter or the cool season, and then again sets seed and dies off as the weather starts to get hot in late spring or early summer. A biennial is somewhat of a hybrid between our annuals and a perennial. A biennial weed will come up and undergo its vegetative growth in the first year of its life cycle, and then in the second year of its life cycle, it'll send up or bolt up its reproductive or flowering seed head parts of the plant, and then it'll set seed and die off after year 2. So it's basically a 2-year deal there. In the case of our perennials, they can live, start out, of course, from seed, but then they start to develop massive underground root systems and continue to grow for years to come. So we've got all kinds of challenges there, especially when it relates to controlling these. Annual grasses specifically, again, as I mentioned before, seasonal growth coming from seed. Mowing is ineffective for control in the case of annual grasses. I mean, and you've probably experienced this where you've mowed crabgrass time and time and time again, even short, you've weed-eated it down, what have you, and it still comes back. Well, that's because it has a lot of basal growing points and, can recover from mowing or weed eating or whatever, in fairly short order. Generally easy to control with pre-emergent herbicides because they are annual. They're going to be coming from seed, and so if you put a preventative pre-emergent herbicide out there, then you're going to, if it's labeled for that particular species, then you're going to be successful in getting it managed. In the case of specific, and this is kind of what I'm talking about in terms of an annual weed, you can see that in this example in the upper right-hand corner, it has a fairly simple root system. It doesn't look like it's broke off from anything or what have you. And it doesn't take much of a root system to support this plant because it only has to live for 6, 7, 8 months from the time it germinates from seed and then sets seed later on in the fall, or in the case of a winter annual, the following spring. So it's only going to build enough of a root system to power the plant through a couple months worth of growth. Specifically, one of the weeds, of course, that's a real pain for us is field sandbur or grass burr. Okay, at this point here, obviously it's not real pernicious to us, but it's when it forms these seed capsules, which are nasty, thorny things. And one point I will make here is these capsules are not the seed. If you break these capsules open, you'll find 2 little amber-colored seed inside there. Well, depending on the time of the year, I should qualify that. They're green until the seed capsule turns brown, and then the seed will eventually get a light brown color later on. But with that said, of course, we have to understand that these capsules they benefit the plant from the standpoint if the capsule gets buried and it soaks up moisture and holds moisture, that helps in the germination of the grass spurs. So it has its own little mechanism for survival, so to speak, which makes it, it doesn't make it a whole lot more difficult to control from a perennial standpoint, but it gives it an advantage in terms of germination and growth early on. Another one, of course, is crabgrass. We have several different crabgrass species. Most of them are characterized by this crowfoot type of seed head at the top. The crabgrass can have smooth leaves with no hairs. They can have hairs on them. They're just pretty, but they all look pretty much the same, with the exception of some of the hairiness characteristics on them. Another one of our more common grasses is goosegrass. Goosegrass has a seed head that looks somewhat like the crabgrass. The way you can tell goosegrass from crabgrass, the easiest way, is to look at the base of the plant, and it has a silvery, a whitish looking appearance right at the basal crown here. And usually goosegrass doesn't come up until the weather starts to get really hot, and 2 to 3 to 4 weeks after crabgrass appears. So again, and you can see this whitish look, so to speak, at the base of the plant early on in its growth stages. One of the winter grasses that we have issues with here, especially in central and southeast Texas, is rescue grass. Rescue grass comes up, it has a hairy leaf, but the most identifying characteristic is this flattened brome type of seed head on it. So again, that's one that we also deal with. Texas panicum, not a big deal in turf grasses. You may see it in landscape beds and what have you. It has fairly large seeds on the seed heads, which make it tough to control because it has the advantage of having large seeds. Another one, if you're in the Beaumont area or the coastal Bend area, jungle rice may be an issue for you. It looks much like barnyard grass. They're both in the same genus. The most distinctive factor about jungle rice is that it has this purplish chevron which transverses the leaf in here. So again, pretty easy to identify those. From the standpoint of annual broadleaf weeds, again, it's much like our grass weeds, germinate seasonally from seed. However, the big difference here is they often can be controlled with close mowing, with a few exceptions. Slender aster, for example, can survive mowing down to 3/4 of an inch height and what have you, but most of them will succumb to, especially if it's consistent mowing, where you're consistently cutting off the top growth. They're not going to be an issue after that. Small seeded broadleaf weeds can be controlled with the same pre-emergent herbicides that we use for our grassy weeds. Our annual broadleaf weeds, again, are going to be the one that I mentioned that survives the close mowing, and that is slender aster. The point to be made about slender aster is it looks quite different when it comes up early in the season versus later on. Later on, it gets this white, wiry looking appearance. Sometimes the stems and the leaves turn almost a blackish color, and they have little dime-sized daisy-looking type flowers on it. And as I said, you wouldn't think that this plant is related to this one when actually they're the same. Of course, henbit, this is one that we have during the winter time. It's now starting to die off, especially if you mowed the lawn, for the several times this spring. It's probably, if you had it, it's probably petering out real quick here. Easy to identify these opposite scalloped leaves, little inconspicuous purplish flowers, and a square stem. This is one of those that I was talking about earlier that's in the mint family, that if you cut the stem on this, you'll see that it's square. Another one that comes up usually adventitiously in areas where you've either got a poor turf stand or whatever is carpet weed. Again, easily identified from that standpoint. Our chickweeds, this is actually the chickweed. This is Sherrardi in there, but the chickweeds are either, they're going to have the same appearance, but they're either going to have a fuzzy leaf, which is mouse ear chickweed, or it'll be smooth, which is common chickweed. And then we have other plants like or weeds like Carolina geranium. This is usually a cool season weed for us. It may hang in through the summer in shady areas that continue to get a lot of moisture. And then, of course, our common mallow. Then we've got a lot of different mallows, but they all look very much the same. Low growing, dense growth, scalloped leaves on them, and what have you. And then the Sherrardia, this happens to also be one that's intermixed here with the chickweed. But Sherrardia is starting to go downhill now. So if this happens to be an issue for you, particularly in Bermuda grass, just give it a couple weeks yet, and it's gonna be out of there because it doesn't survive heat real well. Okay, our perennial grass weeds. The difficulty in our perennial grasses is twofold. In that, first of all, if we're growing a perennial grass turf like Bermuda grass or centipede grass or St. Augustine grass, how do you selectively remove a perennial grass weed from a perennial grass crop? It's very difficult, and we've been encumbered by a reduction in the number of herbicides available for that lately. I'll talk about a few alternatives though. Because it's like our perennial turf grasses, mowing is generally ineffective except for seed head removal. Let's talk just briefly about seed head removal. I oftentimes get this, especially in the case of grass burr, which is an annual, but the same thing could be said about perennial weeds. Does going out there and mowing off the seed heads really help you in terms of eradication? It has some effectiveness, but that effectiveness is pretty minimal because, first of all, you have to remember where those plants are coming from. They're coming from a seed bank already established in the soil that has, hundreds, millions, or whatever amount of dormant seed just waiting for the chance to come up. And they all aren't going to come up in 1 year. And that's why it's real important to remain diligent and consistent in your weed management. No pre-emergent herbicides will control the rootstock, and I'll explain why that's the case here in a second. And few herbicides are available for selective post-emergence control, which I mentioned earlier. Our perennial grasses are going to be things like our KR blue stem, Dallas grass, which probably everybody recognized. You see a lot of KR blue stem along the highways because it's an excellent vegetative cover, and I swear, can grow in pure rock. So it's great for that use. But once it gets into our landscapes, it gets pretty invasive. Dallas grass, of course, has this stubby little perennial rhizome at the base of the plant here, and just spreads and spreads and spreads and spreads. And then it can also spread by seed. We have another plant called knotroot bristlegrass, which, if you're familiar with many of the annual foxtails, it looks like a foxtail, which normally we would consider to be an annual weed. However, knotroot bristlegrass is an exception to that. It has an annual foxtail look, except that it produces rhizomes underneath the soil surface, which keeps this plant alive from year to year. And then Bahia grass, if you live in Central or East Texas, you know this dude. Spreads by shallow rhizomes. Its most distinctive characteristic is its forked seed head in there. Bahia grass makes an excellent turf cover, but it's really hard on mower blades, so you got to sharpen them once a week if you want to use Bahia grass as a lawn. Makes an excellent forage as well. Perennial broadleaf weeds, again, like the perennial grasses, growth is going to come from rootstock established from previous year's growth. Pre-emergence herbicides are generally ineffective on them because it's coming from rootstock and not from seed. Mowing provides only temporary management, and post-emergent herbicides will work well. And there's many, many herbicides, as I'll show you here in a minute, for broadleaf weed control. And our perennials that, for the most part, that we have big issues with are things like Virginia buttonweed. And Virginia buttonweed has almost a highly lignant or woody type of root system underneath it that just generates new growth time and time and time again. So you have to be real diligent and consistent in controlling or managing or trying to manage Virginia buttonweed. Dandelion, of course, we're familiar with what it looks like. The trouble here with dandelion is that it is a tap-rooted plant, but you can weed eat it off, mow it off, whatever, time and time again. But unless you harm these adventitious buds that surround the basal crown area in here, you're not going to do anything to it. And the only way you can do that is you get out your dandelion digger and cut off this carrot-like taproot about 2 to 3 inches below the soil surface, and this guy will die out. Or you have to use a systemic broadleaf herbicide, which gets in the leaves and then moves down into this root system to have an effect on killing it. Examples of those would be things like Weed Be Gone products, what have you. Dollarweed, big issue from College Station over in areas south and east of here for the most part. Again, it's got a nice, leafy structure to it. It's the size anywhere from a quarter to a half a dollar or a silver dollar. Again, the issue here is this massive underground root system that it has underneath the soil surface, again, that helps support any adversity that may have come upon this top growth. So again, you can't cut it off and hope to get control of it because of its ability to come back from this root system. So you have to use a systemic herbicide that's taken up either by the foliage or by the roots and to kill out this rhizome in here. Dayflower is actually an annual, but I put it in the perennial category because it's so difficult to control. You won't see too much of this in lawnscapes, but many times it'll be brought in with container stock, and so it'll get into landscape beds and what have you. And it usually takes, if you're trying to control it in a landscape bed, for example, the best way I've found is a spot spray, obviously shielding desirable plants from the spray with Roundup, and you'll probably have to hit it a couple times, and I'll talk a little bit about those sequential applications here in a second. The last one that I'll talk about here is Dicamba. Dicamba looks very much like dollarweed, except the leaves are smaller and they don't make a full circle. Okay, they have an indentation here where it connects to the petiole of the plant, yet they have almost an identical looking root system as dollarweed. Massive in amounts, which again keeps this plant very hard and difficult to control. Our sedges, many times we can manage these with just cultural practices. Manage our irrigation so that we don't have soppy areas in the lawnscape or in the landscape. There are a few herbicides available for control, but we do have some excellent herbicides. There's 3 herbicides I'll talk about here in a second. Mowing is ineffective. The big 3 that I like to talk about that are most pernicious for us here in Texas, both in lawns and in landscape beds, are green kalinga, yellow nutsedge, or purple nutsedge. And if you look at the flowering structures of these, they help you to identify it fairly easily. Green kalinga has a 3-leaf structure at the top of the stem and has a little ball-like seed head on top of it. One thing about green kalinga that separates it out from other sedges that look similar to it, there are some annual sedges that look similar to this, but green kalinga usually only gets about 6 to 8 inches tall, and it's real thick when it comes up usually. Yellow nutsedge, again, characterized by its yellowish cast on the seed head in here, but it also has, the seed heads have a bottle brush type of appearance to them. And again, this really helps in terms of identifying it. In the case of purple nutsedge, again, a purplish cast to the seed head. It's much more spread out than the yellow nutsedge. It doesn't have a bottle brush type of appearance. And if you dig purple nutsedge up, you're going to see that the plants are connected by a chain of rhizomes and tubers. And some of these tubers may still be dormant, and some of them may have germinated. Just in case you were wondering, if you wonder why when you go out and you pull one purple nutsedge plant up, and then 3 weeks later you have a half a dozen taking its place, well, you've done that by stimulating the germination of the previously dormant tuber. So if this has a chain of dormant tubers on it, and you take the mother plant out here, these guys have to start growing on their own, so they're going to germinate. So don't pull purple nutsedge. Rule of the day. Okay. All right, let's move on to managing these things. There, obviously, with any pest management procedure, we like to talk about integrated plans of attack, whereby we're incorporating preventative measures with cultural, biological, mechanical, and chemical, if at all possible. Now, how heavy you're going to lean on either one of these is going to depend largely upon your situation, whether you've got a 5,000 square foot lawn or a 40-acre soccer complex that you're responsible for. But specifically, I want to, we know about preventative practices if we just stop and think about it. Buy clean seed, clean sod, what have you, clean container plants. If you bring a container plant that you think is just a Burford holly, but you look down, there's some prostrate spurge in there, you're going to have spurge in the landscape. Cultural practices, essentially what we're talking about, grow a good stand of turf or landscape plants or whatever, and they're going to have a lot of competitive ability over the weeds. Specifically, I'm going to talk about some mechanical control. We know about pulling and hoeing and all that other stuff. Specifically, I want to dive a little bit deeper into biological and chemical methods. Biological methods is sometimes defined as using living organisms for weed control. This can also be you can also classify some non-living things that in the biological realm of things. Specifically, we're talking about insects and pathogens. There are insects that specifically feed on certain weed species, and this comes in handy, assuming that they only use that weed species as their food source. The same with pathogens. There are fungal diseases that infect certain weeds and specific weeds, and once that weed dies out, then they disappear, just like the insects. The trick, however, is twofold. First of all, they work very slow, so you got to wait a long time for them to have a high degree of effectiveness. The second thing is they can't move, once they've finished with the specific host that they harm or infect or eat or whatever. You don't want them moving on to a desirable plant. Natural products, corn, gluten meal, and vinegar. Let's talk about vinegar. First of all, vinegar in a 5 to 20% solution is pretty good for burning back vegetation. Much like if you spilled some gasoline on the lawn or whatever, that you have, died out dead tissue temporarily, but the plants will come back, generally speaking. Vinegar is much the same way. Essentially, you're talking about acetic acid here, which burns off the cuticle or waxy coating on the leaves, causing them to dry out. But again, it's ineffective for perennial weeds, because the perennial weeds will come back. Like if you're trying to get rid of Bermuda grass in the cracks in the sidewalk or something like that, it's pretty ineffective. Now, if that was crabgrass, an annual weed, then you'd be successful, at least temporarily. It's non-selective, so if you're trying to kill crabgrass, a spot of crabgrass in a Bermuda grass or St. Augustine grass lawn, you're going to burn both of them back. Now, the St. Augustine or the Bermuda grass will come back, but it's going to look nasty for a while. I would like to talk a little bit about corn gluten meal. It's widely promoted by a lot of different people for weed management. our experience is it's pretty ineffective. Its claim to fame has always been crabgrass control. There are some people that say it controls additional weeds. I've never seen that happen, and I've never seen the data to support that claim. Maybe it's out there. But we've looked at this stuff that, 10 years ago, we looked at it in a trial down in San Antonio, where we put out the recommended rate, twice the recommended rate, and 3 times the recommended rate, and got anywhere from 5 to 6% crabgrass control. We used the synthetic herbicide pendimethalin and got 70% control. In the case of barnyardgrass, again, an equal level of control from the pendimethalin, but very little control from the corn gluten meal, even at 3 times the recommended rate. I got a lot of flack for this study, but so I repeated it in 2009, and these are just some pictures of the treated plots. The darker colored, shorter plant in here is Tifway 419 Bermuda. The taller plant in here is crabgrass. And this is well into the season here. This is the untreated control showing that both the crabgrass in here and the Bermuda grass underneath it. This is the recommended treatment showing no crabgrass control. This is twice the recommended treatment. Again, little, if any, crabgrass control. And this is 3 times the recommended application rate. And again, no crabgrass control. The only difference that you see here is that everything, the Bermuda grass and the crabgrass, is growing quite well because corn gluten meal has about 8 to 10% nitrogen in it. So, you could make the thin argument that if you grow a stronger turf because you're putting a little bit of nitrogen in it, you may have, some competition for the crabgrass, but in terms of pre-emergence control, it doesn't get it. So anyway, enough on that. The least understood, method is often herbicides, especially by the general public, and that's what I've spent 35 years doing. But anyway, to try to simplify it as much as I can here, we've essentially got 2 major categories of herbicides. Herbicides that are applied prior to the emergence of the weed in a preventative fashion and after the weed is up, or in a knockdown or foliar type of application. The biggest thing here is to decide the right formulation, and particularly whether you're using granules or sprays. In the case of granules, if you're using a pre-emergent herbicide, it's all about application accuracy. If you have a fertilizer spreader, just make sure that you calibrate it and make sure that it evenly and uniformly applies the herbicide granules. And then the sprays, they're going to be dependent upon, how big the weed is and what have you. And we'll get into some logical situations there. A little bit on weed and feed products here. I'm not real keen on those because of a couple things. First of all, if they're coated on a fertilizer particle, sometimes, as you've probably seen, fertilizer particles are large and sometimes they're uniformly small. Well, if you throw those out there in the soil, particularly with large particles that have a coating of herbicide on them, then it's not going to migrate laterally enough to cover all the bases in here. And so you're going to have skips where the crabgrass or whatever else might take advantage of that and be able to come in. Probably the largest issue I have with weed and feed products for pre-emergent herbicides, for crabgrass or goosegrass control, what have you, is the fact that you're applying the herbicide too early to get any benefit from the fertilizer. And you'll understand this more clearly in a little bit when I talk about timing of pre-emergence applications. You've got to get the preventative pre-emergence applications out there prior to the weeds germinating. And by the time it's appropriate to apply fertilizer, your grass, your perennial lawn grasses should be well developed and kicked out of dormancy, a lot of green growth on them, what have you. So there's generally a lag time in there from a couple to 3 months. So your fertilizer's laying out there doing nothing but dissipating for 3 months prior to the time when it can be effectively and efficiently used by the turf grass. So again, you know, in the northern states, you know, when bluegrass needs the fertilizer, for example, and the crabgrasses are not yet up, then this makes a whole lot more sense. But in our southern turf grasses, this doesn't fit real well. A little quick note here on herbicide naming, and you've seen this as you buy bottles or containers of herbicides. Herbicides have 3 names. They have a chemical name, a common name, and a trade name. Okay, the common name is often called also the active ingredient. You know, I'm sure very familiar with Roundup. The active ingredient or the common name for Roundup is glyphosate. Chemical name, not, you know, unless you want to draw off the structure and have fun with organic chemistry, that's one thing, but not a whole lot of use to us. But this is, because you can look on the shelf and find a lot of glyphosate products. Some of them are going to be trade named Roundup, but there may be a lot of other glyphosate products out there that are the same concentration in the same size container that may be more economical for you. So just, you know, like medicines and any other type of you know, chemistry, you know, it's an active ingredient or the common name that you want to keep on top of. Okay, a little bit about grass control, annual grass control, and how this happens. When we put out a pre-emergent herbicide, they're migrated into the top inch or 2 or 3 of the soil surface, just based on their chemistry. And they have certain what we call adsorptive properties or connective properties to where they latch on to soil clay and organic matter and stay put in this top 1 to 3 inches in here. And the reason this is important for that chemistry to work that way is that they have to be in an area and stay in an area where the weed seeds are going to be germinating and come from. Now, we may have weed seeds scattered from the upper soil surface all the way down to 12 or 18 inches or however deep in here, but the only ones that we have to worry about are the ones that are going to get the light, temperature, and moisture response to help them break dormancy. And especially if they're small-seeded weeds like crabgrass, for example, they're going to come from about the top inch of soil. A crabgrass seed buried 5 inches deep is not going to have the stimulus that it's going to take for it to break dormancy. And even if it does, it's not going to have the horsepower or the size to push it through several inches of soil. So again, it's very, very important that these herbicides remain in this shallow layer of soil so that they're there. In the herbicides, you know, they don't, like it says down here, do not prevent weed seeds from germinating. What they do is that once these weed seeds germinate and send out a little bitty shoot or a little bitty root, they stop the root growth or the shoot growth so that you don't even see them come through the soil surface, generally speaking. Now, in terms, and granted, there are a lot of different products out here, but this is just a generalization of pre-emergent herbicides used for annual grass control. So again, we're talking about things like barnyardgrass and crabgrass and goosegrass. There's a major family or chemistry of herbicide called the dinitroanilins. And within this group fall a lot of trade name and active ingredient herbicides, such as Barricade. Active ingredient is prodiamine, pendulum. There are a lot of different pendimethalin products, one of them being pendulum. And then you'll see a lot of benethin and combinations of benethin and trifluralin out there. Again, look for these active ingredients or the common names in here. Dimension and Ronstar, they are not dinitroanilins, but are pre-emergent herbicides used for annual grass control. Now, one thing about these is that the dinitroanilins and Dimension, as their chemistry, they inhibit the root system of emerging roots. Okay, so the downside of emerging roots as they come out from the weed seed. that they're trying to control, and they stop root growth and therefore kill the plant out. Now, the downside of this is if you have stoloniferous growth on your turf where it's trying to peg down, then it will inhibit the growth of these stoloniferous roots. It won't kill out the green part of that stolon, but it will inhibit those roots that are trying to peg down in there. And this could be an issue for you if, for example, you're trying to get the turf to fill in, a 5-yard, a 5-foot bare spot or something like that. And if that's the case, there is an alternative called Ronstar, which affects shoot growth in the seedling plants. It keeps those weeds from emerging. So in a stoloniferous plant, since it doesn't affect root growth, then you can get by with that. So Ronstar, or the active ingredient in Ronstar, is called oxadiazone, so that's a good alternative there. Timing for these, again, since you got to get it out there before the weeds germinate, would be late February to early March for Central Texas. Goosegrass 2 to 4 weeks later, so you got a little bit more lag time if you're going after goosegrass. For the most part, January, February is going to be in time for most of Texas. And the reason for this lag time from goosegrass to crabgrass is that crabgrass will generally germinate at 55 degrees soil temperature at 4 inches deep, okay? And goosegrass will come up once the temperatures get to be 60 degrees at 4 inches deep. And the lag time between a 55 degree soil temperature and a 60 degree soil temperature is going to take a while, sometimes a couple weeks, sometimes it may be a couple months, and it's going to vary from year to year. So again, get it out there plenty early so that you're prepared, so that when these soil temperatures warm up, you're in good shape there. One thing I'll mention about these pre-emergence annual grass control herbicides, it's not necessarily based on grasses or broadleafs as it is seed size. So if you have a small seeded broadleaf plant like pigweed or spurge, it's also going to control those. Now, our perennial grass weeds that we pointed out earlier here, from KR bluestem to Dallas grass, we don't have a whole lot of options, especially for residential turf. If you're in commercial, like golf courses and sod growing, then you can still use the product called MSMA, in Bermuda grass and zoysia grass turfs. But for homeowner use, it's essentially is gone for them and probably won't come back. If you have centipede grass, okay, as a turf, you can use Vantage or Sethoxydim as a knockdown selective weed control agent. All right. The herbicide Envoy or Clethodim, the active ingredient Clethodim, is also safe if you're growing centipede up in northeast Texas, for example. If you're growing zoysia or tall fescue, you can use Phenoxyprop or Fluazafop products, trade named Fusilade or Acclaim in there. You can also use Quinclorac or Drive for crabgrass control, which you have to get put it on small crabgrass. It's not as effective as a knockdown on larger weeds as the Phenoxyprop and Fluazafop is. For broadleaf weed control, again, whether we're talking about our annuals, such as all those we've discussed here, or whether we're talking about our perennials, it's pretty much the same ball of wax. There are a bewildering number of products out there. Most broadleaf weed control is done with post-emergent herbicides. And really, there's a good reason for this, in that we have a lot of products to control broadleaf weeds in grass turf. Where we are limited is in grass control products that are safe for the turf. And most of what I've talked about are our pre-emergence products. So we have to put our grass control herbicides out in a kind of an expecting type of mode where we think we're going to have crabgrass, and if we want to control it effectively, we better get a pre-emergence or preventative herbicide out there. In the case of broadleaf control, we have a lot of options. so we can wait and see what comes up and then get after them. A lot of different post-emergence products. There's some products like atrazine and simazine that have both pre-emergence and knockdown or post-emergence activity, and some that only have pre-emergence activity. And I said earlier, there's a number of 2- and 3-way mixtures on the market, and a lot of these products that you'll find out there, whether it's Weed Be Gone products or whatever, they will have from 1 to 3 or 4 different active ingredients in them. And these products are all fairly old products, so there's a lot of different mixtures out there that various people, formulators, try and put in the bottle, so to speak. But a lot of different products out there, again, will have some of these 3- and 4-way mixtures. Usually the stronger or more powerful ones will have the Dicamba in them, because it's pound for pound or ounce for ounce more powerful than the rest of these in here. And you'll find lesser amounts of it in many of these products here. And what we're talking about here is, for example, if we compare this triplet with triplet, whatever that is, I can't even remember. But this one has more 2,4-D in it, and this one less 2,4-D. This one has less MCPP, but this one has more MCPP, even though they have, and the same thing here for Dicamba, even though they have the same products, they have more or less of them depending on which product you're talking about. Same goes for Triamine and Tripower up here. I mentioned earlier that sometimes we need to use a couple applications to increase our effectiveness. And what I'm talking about here is if, for example, you squirt a weed with Roundup, or you squirt a weed with Weed Be Gone, and it's not dead in 2 weeks, then hit it again, okay? But don't let the weed get healthy before you retreat. What you're doing is weakening and predisposing, making that plant sick, so that when you come in with that second shot, then you finish the job or finish it off, so to speak. But if you let it get healthy again, you're starting back at ground zero. So, and that's much the case with our herbicides that we're treating Virginia buttonweed or the dayflower that I mentioned earlier, where I said many times it's going to take 2 applications of Roundup. Give it a week, 10 days, 2 weeks in there, and if it's not graveyard dead, hit it again. Nutsedge Control, we talked about the 3 biggies. We have 3 excellent products for Nutsedge Control at present: Sedge Hammer or halosulfuron, Certainty sulfosulfuron, and Monument trifloxysulfuron. And they're all, you see, they're all sulfuron, sulfuron, sulfuron. They all fall into the category of excuse me. There's a class of herbicides that I'm drawing a blank on right now. Oh, sulfonylurea herbicides. There we go. Sometimes it takes me a while to figure this out. Anyway, these are all in the sulfonylurea group of herbicides. Low use rates. This is the only thing that's a little bit of a downer in terms of mixing these things in a 1-gallon pump-up sprayer and getting them actively applied, but they're all very effective. Some are safe on most of our turf grasses. Some are a little more picky, such as the case of Monument, only used on Bermuda and Zoysia turf. One thing I will point out and there's a lot of these new low use rate herbicides. Generally speaking, the only people comfortable with using a lot of these low use rate herbicides are commercial applicators. The point I will make here is that all of these products are not cleared for all types of turf grass. So, some may be tolerant, some may not. So these don't all paint with a broad brush. So be careful about that. The other thing is that not all of these new chemistries are available for residential turf. In some cases, only commercial turf. So keep that in mind. And with that, at the end of the season, evaluate your results, make a note of it, and follow up with good turf management. Because if you don't grow a good stand of turf, you're going to have a major weed problem every year. So soil test, fertilize according to that soil test, and you won't you won't need this webinar again. Anyway, so with that, I'll take any questions.